Hello again. So, in the first two meditations, we've seen that Descartes, hypothesizes the evil demon. We've seen that he knows nothing of the external world, and that he's proved his own existence. So, at this point, Descartes is only certain of one thing existing, that is, himself. So he doesn't know that trees exist, or that houses exist, or that other people exist, or that, well, I guess I was going to say phones, but silly goose, he didn't have phones back then. He doesn't know that cups exist. Oh, trusty ceramic cup. So what does he know exists outside of himself? Well, nothing. Right? So we see then why Descartes needs God. Because if we can think about it, right, so think about it this way, right? So Descartes, right, you've got sort of Descartes here, right, and he's all by himself, right? Like, my name's Descartes, and I'm all alone. The problem is that Descartes doesn't know if there is anything outside of himself. So what does he do? Well, he proves that there's this entity, right? God exists, right? And so at the very least, right, minimally what he does is he's proven that there exists at least one more thing outside of himself, right? Namely God. So in this third meditation, what Descartes does is he proves God's existence. Looking ahead to the sixth meditation, Descartes is going to use God's existence and the fact that God isn't a deceiver as reason to think that there's an external world. So we can think of it this way, right? You've got Descartes over here, you've got God up here, and you've got the external world over here. I'm the external world, right? And so what Descartes does is he relies on God as a kind of guarantor that his perceptions of the world are accurate. So his proof for God's existence, his arguments for God's existence are really important because they allow him to literally get outside of himself. God acts as the bridge between Descartes and the external world. So we find a proof in this meditation, right, this third meditation. We also find a proof in the fifth meditation, but I think it's just a crappier version of Anselm's ontological proof, and the one in the third meditation is a lot neater, so that's why I like doing this one. So what's the proof? Well, what I'm going to do is right now I'm going to sketch the proof, and then I'll put some notes up on, I'll put up some notes so you can sort of follow along after this. So there are two premises to the argument, right? So thinking back to your critical thinking days, the argument is a modus ponens argument, right? If A, then B, A, therefore B. So here's how the argument goes. If I have an idea of God, then God exists. First premise. The second premise. I have an idea of God. Conclusion, God exists. So again, if I have an idea of God, then God exists. I do have an idea of God, therefore God exists. So let's take a look at this first premise. If I have an idea of God, then God exists. So put in other words, what this means is that merely having an idea about God is evidence for God's existence. Right, so merely having the idea that God exists is evidence that God actually exists. So how exactly does an idea of God act as evidence of God existing? Because after all, I have ideas about all sorts of things. Big rock candy mountains, rivers full of Mountain Dew, maybe not Mountain Dew, but that stuff. I think about stuff occasionally. So why don't those things, right, why don't those ideas act as evidence of those things existing? Well, the idea about God is a special idea. And it's a special idea because it's an idea about God. More specifically, it's an idea about an entity that is infinite. Now, everything about me is finite. I have thoughts that begin, thoughts that end. I was born, one day I'm going to die. Everything I know is finite. But an idea of God is an idea of the infinite, right? So the question to ask ourselves is, since I have this idea of the infinite, where on earth could it have come from? Well, maybe I came up with the idea of God, right? That's one possibility. But Descartes says, no, that can't be right, because I'm a finite thing, and I can't have an idea of the infinite simply from an idea of the finite, right? I think about God, right? And I'm like, well, what is God like, right? What is it to be infinitely compassionate, right? And I think about my own compassion, and I think, well, my own compassion without limits. Well, that's not terribly informative for Descartes. I think about what it is to exist outside of time, right? And I think, well, what's my experience of existing inside time? Well, I mean, things happen sequentially. So maybe if I conceive of things happening all at once and not sequentially, then I'll have an idea of God, right? But again, he's like, well, what does that even mean, right? Like, I can't, like, that, simply taking away finitude isn't really going to give me an idea of the infinite, right? Because for Descartes, it's just weird to think that taking away the limit of finitude will propel us towards an idea of the infinite. So he says it can't be me. And so he concludes, since again the only thing that he knows exists is himself, is that the idea must have come from elsewhere, right? So the idea of God isn't an idea that I came up with, right? This idea had to come from somewhere else. Well, so let's consider the kind of thing that would have given me this idea of God. Could that thing be a finite thing? And the answer for Descartes is no, for the very same reasons that I couldn't have generated the idea of God myself. I am but a humble, finite thing, right? And I cannot even hope to capture the vastness of the infinite magnitude of God. And in fact, no finite thing can hope to encompass the infinite magnitude of God. So this other thing that's given me the idea of God, that thing itself can't be a finite thing. So the thing that's given me this idea of God must itself be something infinite. That is to say, God, right? Only an infinite entity, only an infinite being could have given me an idea of the infinite. Another way of thinking about it is that finite things are just too puny in the sense of being to provide me with an idea of the infinite, right? Think about it in terms of numbers, right? No single, right, right. Like if you think about a number line, right, we usually think about it as starting at 0 and just stretching off into the distance. Well, if you pick any number along that number line, that number is going to be closer to 0 than it is to the end of the number line, right? Because at any point, there's always at any point along that number line, there's an infinite number of numbers left to cover, right? So no single number on the number line can capture the entirety of the number line. And in the same way, no finite object can capture what it is to be infinite. So no finite thing could give me the idea of God. Right? Only God could have given me the idea of God. So that's the evidence, or that's the reasoning behind this first premise. If I have an idea of God, then God is the cause of my idea of God, right? There cannot be anything else that could cause in me the idea of God. The second premise says, I have an idea of God. Right? So, what's the evidence for this? Well, really, I just have to sort of think about my own thoughts. Right? I think about the stuff that I think about, right? I reflect on my thoughts, and I think about stuff like water. I think about stuff like, what am I going to make for dinner tonight? I think about stuff like, oh crap, did I turn off the oven? Oh crap, did I pay the rent? Right? These are the things I think about. Among the things I think about is God. So I know I have an idea of God because I can just think about my own thoughts, or I can introspect, and I can find in there an idea about God. So I have an idea of God, and that idea could only have come from God. So God must exist to be the origin of my idea of God. Now, Descartes gives this kind of an idea a special name. He calls it an innate idea. So an innate idea is an idea that I'm born with. Right? So my idea of God is an innate idea. I didn't learn it from anywhere. I didn't make it up myself. It doesn't seem to come from outside of me, right? So like, I'm sort of bracketing the whole stuff about the demon for a hot second, right? So I've got a marker right here, right? I've got a perception of the marker. This idea about the marker, my perception of the marker, seems to come from something outside of me, right? It's coming at me, right? When this thing crosses my field of vision, when it crosses your field of vision, you have no choice but to see a marker there, right? That is to say, the marker comes, right? Your perception of the marker is caused by something outside of you, right? And so our idea of God doesn't come at us like the idea of a marker, rather, right? Like the perception of a marker. So the only other alternative is that this idea is in us from birth, right? That we are born with this idea of God, and that we have to bring it up to the surface, right? And we do that through interacting with parents, interacting with the community, whatever. So, at the end of meditation 3, what do we have? Well, let's review. For meditation 1, we still don't know if anything outside of us, or if anything in the external world exists, right? It's still possible that that all of my senses are lying to me, right? So that condition is still in play. But from the second meditation, I know that I exist, and if, right, that's an important qualifier there, if there's an external world, then everything in the external world is essentially extended. It must take up room in space. So we have those two bits from the second meditation. From the third meditation, what we get is that we know God exists. And so Descartes tacks on a few things at the end of the third meditation and the beginning of the fourth, which we'll talk about on Friday. And an important property of God is that God is perfect. Now, what is divine perfection? Well, it's kind of sticky. If you want to learn more about that, I suggest picking up, just Googling around on philosophy of religion. You can look up divine perfection. Or if you want to, when you have to take your philosophy elective, you can take, if you have the opportunity, you can take a class in philosophy of religion. You can learn more about divine perfection that way. But importantly for us, if God is perfect, that means that God isn't a deceiver, right? God doesn't screw with us, right? God wouldn't trick us into thinking things that weren't true without, at least giving us the heads up. Why is that? Well, Descartes has this kind of enigmatic line where he says, deception is incompatible with perfection. Right? Again, deception is incompatible with perfection. So if something is perfect, then it has no need to deceive. Why is that the case? I don't know. He doesn't really give us an idea. He doesn't really give us a reason to think that. So we'll just take it on board for the ride. But it's important to keep that in mind, because that claim that perfection excludes deception is going to do a lot of work for Descartes in both the fourth and the sixth meditation.